All right, so welcome to the August meeting of the Village Planning Commission. Tonight, unfortunately, Paul Travis seems to be caught in traffic, and so is Alvin Scott. They're on their way in, and we hope they'll be here very shortly. Joe McLaughlin is at the memorial service, and Laura Devine is on vacation, so and Ed unfortunately could not make it, so it's just the three of us. We had on the agenda, we had a proposed agenda tonight, but I think that in terms of the historic district code review, I think that we should wait until Eldon comes, since he was the one who led the effort, who is leading the effort. As to the central parking lot, I believe Joe McLaughlin is the one leading the effort, so I think those two discussions should be tabled either to the next meeting or if Eldon comes later. And the third item was the research and feasibility study for water quality and wastewater management. There I can speak a little bit about it. A few years ago we did propose a sewer system for the Central Village Business District. That study had been funded by the county. We had worked closely with the Department of Public Works as well as a local engineering firm who developed a plan that was actually a very good plan with a minimum disruption, whereby we would connect all of the businesses wastewater in the back of the buildings, on the parking lot, where most of them have their septic systems, and then connect from those existing septic systems onto new pumping stations, and then go to a proposed treatment plant that was going to be located behind the police station. This plan was not reviewed, was not adopted. We wanted to study more other alternatives, and the cost came up a little higher. Subsequent to this, we have a lot of regulations have been changed, and other opportunities have come from the state and the federal governments. We have looked at a possible doing a private-public partnership for the development of the central sewage system. One element I think we have discussed is exactly which area do we want the wastewater district to serve, whether it should only be the village business district or maybe expand it a little bit more to be able to address maybe the areas around Lake Agawam or areas along the North Sea Road.
I have a couple of questions whenever.
Yes, go ahead.
So you were involved in the original planning as a consultant or as the village?
No, I represent the Village Planning Commission.
Okay, perfect. Do we know where that information is? You know, I'd like to start reviewing some of that historical information. I say historical, just, you know, I know there's been a lot of studies on the lake.
Yeah.
I just don't know where to go to find that information.
Yeah, absolutely. There was a time where that study was posted online.
Okay.
We had it on the village website. It was a very extensive study. I mean, the engineering firm that had been retained really went beyond their call of their studies, and the engineering was actually very well done.
Okay.
Definitely, we could make it available again. In this case, because of the plant was located just behind the police station,
right.
the size of the plant was very limited.
Okay.
So the area that we could service with that plant was very limited, strictly limited to the village business district, with basically one loop.
Okay.
But it's a good study. I think that personally, I think that we should try to see whether we could enlarge the area that's being serviced
I know there's been a lot of technology changes in the sewer treatment facilities in the last few years, right? The Suffolk County is adopting new ideas and different things. Is that correct, or not so much?
The new technology is at the plant itself.
Okay.
Yes, the new technology is at the plant itself, and the water quality of the effluent from the plant. But for example, right now in California, where they are basically mandating sewering everywhere, they're actually reusing. They are creating systems that have now a purple pipe.
They do that in Florida all the time. You see it.
Yeah. So they actually, out of those smaller sewage treatment plants, it comes out. The water is a recycled water, and it has a purple pipe. And they use it and people who are on the main that has that purple main are mandated to connect into that water supply system for their irrigation system, and for all the golf course must connect to it. All the cemeteries must connect to it.
Okay.
So I mean, the technology is there. We definitely have the technology to treat the water. It's how much we want to treat. But this technology is at the plant.
Okay.
And there'll be various options. But what we need to decide more is where is the plant going to be located, and how much of an area do we want to service.
Okay.
The other thing you got to keep in mind, in a study was done at I think Stony Brook University published a book, but the state of New York and Suffolk County did in 1960 water, how much water Suffolk County would have. And how many people? I think it was 2.5 million people. And what the biggest problem that they stated was the sewer treatment plants pumping the treated water back out into the ocean and not letting it go back into the aquifer. And that was the biggest problem they felt was going on.
Yeah,
because I even told us to the town board, I said, you see these 10,000 gallon tankers going by carrying sewage water, going to a treatment plant out in the ocean, not back into our recharge system. And that's totally wrong.
It's absolutely. When we, on the plan, we should definitely call for a treatment of the water such that it could be completely reinjected into the water supply.
Okay.
I mean, on the alternative, if we have a big enough area, then we could possibly reuse some of that water for irrigation or...
Which would ultimately put it back into the...
Lake Agawam, if it's possible to go back into Lake Agawam.
Yeah. Yes. So, right. I think that I think it's a priority for us, for the village.
Right.
It's the water table is rising. It's impossible to get any new septic system approved within the confines of the village business district. The health department will not allow the water table being too high. So it's really impeding any development, and certainly any residential development that we want to put on top of any businesses. The other element is that presently the code, the health code, restricts the use of, restricts the possible developments on any site by the gallonage that you're allowed of the wastewater based on the size of the lots. And because we have so many small lots in the village business district, the amount of allowable flow that you have for each lot is minimus. It's minimus. So you cannot develop anything. It's very hard. But once you have a sewage treatment plant, the health code is different. Once you have a sewage treatment plant, that restriction and the calculation of the allowable wastewater goes away.
Okay.
You do what's called Appendix A or Appendix B, and then it goes away. So it's also another argument why we should go for a centralized wastewater district. Because
Ed mentioned to me, he asked me, do you know where the water source for Lake Agawam comes from? And I often wondered that. Is it from the runoff or is it from springs? Nobody seems to know. If the village goes around and puts in all these drainage fields around it and you stop all the water from going in, then we won't have a lake anymore. That's something that's got to be looked into.
Right.
I mean, it might sound like a silly
Yeah.
question, but
Can I speak from here?
Yeah,
Or-
sure. Why don't
Yeah,
you,
so Charlie can hear you.
Okay,
Can you
yeah.
hear at the microphone?
So this is a one-day exercise,
State your
and
name.
I'm Rob Coburn. I live on 345 Hill Street. As Kimberly knows and some others, and I mentioned at your last meeting, I brought a gentleman here who is a water treatment and water quality expert, grew up on Shelter Island. And he hasn't done any geological studies, doesn't have the data, but I drove him around for about 20 minutes up to the highway and around Lake Agawam a couple times. His belief, to answer the specific question, was that the catchment for Lake Agawam, it's an underground flow that comes in probably in multiple locations, 20 or 30 locations into the lake was his assessment, knowing the geology generally, and that it's really catching water from a mile west on Hill Street, where the rise is. It's catching water almost 3/4 of a mile east to basically Old Town Road or just this side of it, and at least up to the highway. And most of that is going underground at different depths. There may be going down low enough that some of it's coming up as springs in the lake, but most of it is flowing on a more subsurface basis into the edge of the lake. And that he also made the important point that it doesn't flow evenly as though it was a children's sandbox, that over time silts and clays will have directed that flow underground to certain places where there are essentially underground streams and rivers to carry that water in. And one of his recommendations was to try to do enough studying of the specific geology and of water flows by some testing to try to figure out, using the 80-20 rule, where maybe 80% of the water is likely to be flowing in half a dozen to a dozen places, to concentrate some studies and efforts on those places.
so one of the issues that this water that's drained, as you see, underground and catching all of the septic system and all of the, within the confine of that tributary area, this water is really untreated.
It's entirely untreated.
It's completely untreated, and not only untreated, but also untreated for, yeah, exactly.
Well, and to that point, and this was part of his point as well, whatever goes in with that water, and if you're putting it into a septic system, it's pretty bad stuff in terms of the concentrations of nitrates and maybe phosphates and some other things. There's not much biological activity in those septic wells. As it comes out as effluent, the concentration is pretty high. There's no biological activity and very little root activity for most of that flow zone. So it gets carried along. The water itself may migrate as much as a mile or so in a year, the underground water, but it doesn't pull all of the impurities along. It leaves them in the soil. It charges the soil, so that actually there's some physical filtering that goes on. So the water that we see in the lake, which we know is bad, may be a lot better than the water you test half a mile away in some cases, given the pesticide and fertilizer and septic charge that's in there. And his point would be that the sewer district sounds great if we could do everything as a sewer district. It hasn't led to overdevelopment in Sag Harbor to have a sewer district. It's allowed sort of comfortable development and rational capital investment. But that will do nothing, the sewer system will do nothing to take care of the charge that is in there currently. And it's substantial. It's 50 to 150 years of agricultural fertilizers and pesticides and residential fertilizers and pesticides and pretty intensive septic use. So that charge will continue to get carried even with cleaner water going in. If we're lucky enough to get IA systems or a sewer district, whoever is down in the ground there, in most cases likely to be below where any biological activity will degrade it. We'll absorb the nitrates and release as nitrogen gas. So that will all get carried over time, still continued into the lake for some period of time. Decades.
So is there any idea of how they can track where those underground water flows are? Like, are there the ability to dig test holes someplace? And
You can dig test holes. You can apparently use some flow meters in terms of buoys in different parts of the lake, and you can take one buoy and move it around and figure out some temperature gradients that tell you whether fresh water is coming in versus the ambient water that's been there heating up.
Right.
It'll be cooler coming out of the ground. So you can collect some data on a relatively basic basis. It'll take a little while, but you can begin to map out where those likely flows are coming into the lake.
Okay.
And if we're lucky enough that there are 5 or 6 places where, 50% or more of the water is flowing into the lake, then it gives you an opportunity to take one of them that appears to have significant flow in the right space, and there are some organic treatment methods or other interception methods for either chemical treatment or organic treatment that can be put in the ground permanently with 80-year-plus lives to help treat that effluent. And what it does is you create an environment for biological activity further down than it would normally go by digging trenches, filling it with aggregate, and some source of carbon, sawdust or wood chips or something like that. You don't need to, people ask, do you need to seed the bacteria? No, the bacteria will find it. They're close enough and they'll find it quickly. So that would be one general recommendation he would have for thinking about treating Agawam in particular, would be to try to find some places where either on private properties or in the park or other public rights of way where you could hopefully identify significant flow and maybe begin putting in some treatment trenches to see if that had an effect.
They're not that expensive.
They're not expensive. To do about 100 feet, a 100-foot trench, you need to understand exactly where the flow. You need to dig at least one test well where you're going to do it to see exactly where the flow levels are.
Right.
There might be a flow zone that's 8 feet tall. There might be a flow zone that's 8 inches tall, and you need to find where that is.
Right.
And dig the trench down below that, far enough below. And then you do some simple testing. But that 100-foot trench, if you did a 100-foot trench at Lake Agawam, could be on the order of $25,000 to $40,000 to install. And then you cover it over with lawn, you don't see it. There's no equipment, there's no mechanicals, nothing. You just dig test wells before and after it so that over time you can watch the pre-treatment water quality and the post-treatment water quality
Right.
and see if it's working.
And any idea, like historically, are those water flows in valleys, or is it all?
The surface topology doesn't necessarily tell you where the flows are. It can tell you a little bit and some likelihoods. It'll help concentrate the surface water, but it really depends on where silt and clays have deposited over time or been deflected over time.
There's different layers of clay, and I've seen situations where you can, 2 houses next door to each other, right? One house, the basement will be dry, and the other one will be flooded because he's sitting on a clay pocket. And when it rains, the water just comes up through his basement. And yet the guy next door is not on it. And that's the way water will flow. It depends on the layers of clay, how it will work its way through.
Hope that's helpful.
Thank you so much.
So I think that the next step for us would be to maybe create, what I would recommend to have a subcommittee that maybe looks into it and that comes up with, some recommendations to the Planning Commission, which we could then take it to the town board, and various alternatives in terms of possible location of the plant, types of systems, area of services that we want to do, and then also a possible treatment of Lake Agawam.
But remember, we still have to get the town trustees, because that's their lake. They have to agree to all this stuff.
Right. I think it needs to be a whole community effort. I think
So
that,
the town owns the lake?
The town trustees own
the lake.
the lakes,
The town-
all the bodies of water around. And they
Okay.
had a huge lawsuit many, many years ago with the state of New York, and they lost it.
They were trying to shed it to New York State, or?
Well, what happened is, at the turn of the century, the proprietors had sold off all the lands. So then they started selling off all bay bottoms and everything else. And William S. Pelletreau was part of the proprietor group, and he was also elected town official, which he got voted out of office. But I can't remember his first name, White. He had the house on the corner of Jagger Lane. He was the, they didn't have supervisors in those days, but he was the head of the town. And he fought them on that, and he also fought them on keeping the beaches open, because they claimed they own right to the water line. He said, no, you don't, the trustees do. And he won both cases.
Okay. So the town won with the
Yes.
state lost. Okay.
Yeah. And Mecox Bay was originally Estabrook Pen Company. He bought the lake, the whole, and he wanted to grow oysters in there. And he had married a Rose, and I forgot the connection, but his wife's brother was involved with town government or one of the proprietors. There was a whole connection in there.
Shocking.
Yes, no, nothing changes, just names and places.
Awesome. Thank you.
okay, so I think that this would be the next step to try to maybe, have a subcommittee and maybe invite other people to be part of it, such that we
Yeah.
deal with all the aspects of implementing.
We discussed it last month because there's also the homeowners association around the lake, is that right? There's a group that has formed?
Yeah.
So we did touch on it briefly at our last meeting about, starting to get together
Yeah.
and doing more research and work on that.
Can I make one other thing?
Yes,
Please.
With respect to the study, I think there is a study under Village Studies on the main website page. You have to pull that down, and then you have to scroll down 40 or 50 studies in no particular order. It's difficult to find. That was the status. I'm on the ARB. I'm not here officially for them, but that was the status, for instance, of the village architectural guidelines in the historic district when I joined the board. And a few of us got the link to that document moved to the ARB page. What I might suggest, in my opinion, you guys do a great job of sticking on this issue and moving forward, and I know the trustees have been on it as well. But if there's a way that someone could put 2 or 3 of the studies, maybe even the 1960 Suffolk County study, but the sewage study as well, onto the Planning Commission page, I think that's where people expect to see it. And there's an educational role, I think. My opinion is we need to begin not only letting people know about this issue more, but scaring them a little bit. And some of those studies and some of the premises for the studies can have a big public education impact. I know the mayor and the trustees and you guys and others are doing a good job of keeping this top of mind, but there's one opportunity anyway on that webpage to put a couple things on, maybe with some comments as to why they're important.
Yeah, and the study that there was done by this last engineering firm was very complete. They went way beyond what they were being paid for, and they did a great job. Yeah, so we should put it back on the website.
Great.
All right, so that's for our third item. And then any other business that we should bring up?
The only thing I want to say, I just came back from San Francisco, and my relatives took me to this particular military installation in San Francisco.
Mm-hmm.
And they took me into where they had the cameras and stuff like that and videos. So I'm watching this video, and all of a sudden they talk about this mountain lake they had there when they took over the property in 1994. And they showed pictures of this lake. It was absolutely as green as ours. What ran through it was the road going to the Golden Gates Bridge. Runoff was going, they had a golf course the other side. They had the wrong shrubbery, wrong type of animal. Everything that we have in our lake, they had. And it was also shallow. But I tried to find out if there was any books. They didn't have any, but they just gave me the name of the trust. I got to try, and they showed the picture. After they cleaned the lake, it was crystal clear. I want to know what they did to clean the lake up. It might help us. And it was just strictly by accident. You know how they have these videos? You just punch and look, and all of a sudden, there it was in front of me.
Okay, so interesting. Another item that you want to discuss is other items. We should maybe take back, or we welcome the suggestions of any areas that the public would like us to take on in terms of reviewing. I know there was a lot of interest in developing more sidewalks within the village, and also reviewing the quality of our sidewalks. I think our Public Works Department has done a great job recently in improving and replacing some of the sidewalks, but I think that we should create much more of a walking-friendly streetscape.
Yeah.
I brought up a point years ago about extending the sidewalk up Hill Street.
Yeah, exactly.
Because when my kids were younger, we used to ride, and of course we'd have to ride on the street. Otherwise, we'd ride down on the sidewalks. But the sidewalk only goes up to Halsey Street, right? It doesn't go beyond that. Or does it go up to?
It ends someplace between Moses and Corrigan.
Yeah, someplace in there. And at that time, when they built the sidewalk, there really wasn't any development up in that area.
Right.
But, whether it's feasible to extend that sidewalk all the way to the village.
No, absolutely.
I think there should be at least, you should be able to walk from the western village line to the eastern village line on a sidewalk.
Yes.
I don't know, from the train
then-
station. From
right.
the trains, you should be able to walk from the train station.
But you
To the beach.
remember as a child growing up, you go out on Hill Street, you didn't have to worry about traffic.
Right. That has certainly changed. But even First Neck Lane, the beach access, we should be able to get from train station to the beach. Or,
On the sidewalk.
yeah, east, west, and
I don't
south.
know if the estate section would approve of that. That's, I think you get away with it on Hill Street, but I don't know if you get away with First Neck Lane.
So I owned a house that was a Halsey house, and then it was owned by the family of George Stump many years ago. They gave me some pictures when I bought the house. I could take copies of them. There used to be an 8-foot wide sidewalk and cinders all the way down the north side of Hill Street, as far as the camera shows, which is at least a Corrigan in some of these shots, 8 feet wide in the right-of-way, and all the way back into the village. The only remaining 8-foot section is in front of my house. It's two concrete sections wide. In addition to crosswalks, sidewalks, which I agree, we should have more sidewalks, and some of them need to be maintained a little better. There's some shrubs growing out. Property owners need to be reminded to trim back shrubs and that sort of thing. But crosswalks are part of the walking issue, and Kimberly knows that this is something she's worked with me on and talked about. It happens now year-round, but I see it in the summer, and it's no exaggeration to say I see it a dozen times a day. I'm going to be at the next trustees meeting to remind them of a dialogue that we've had over the last couple of years, that on Hill Street and maybe elsewhere in the village outside of the central business district seems to have good crosswalks. And decent, people are getting more used to stopping and looking for pedestrians. That seems to be working. But when you get just outside of it, there's still a lot of pedestrians or bicyclists who are trying to cross the road by, hopping off their bikes. And I watch 12 times a day on a Saturday or Sunday in the summer. I watch people wait for 2, 3, 5 minutes. It's usually families with little kids. And while the traffic should stop, right, that's the law, they don't. No one does. And I have a picture on my phone I could show you of a mother and child who waited at the end of my driveway, got about a 100-foot break finally after about 4 minutes, and dashed across the street. 8-year-old kid maybe 7 or 8-year-old kid on a bike, and a young mother, and they were panicked. So the idea that we've talked with the trustees about is finding, maybe even on a test basis, 1 or 2 or 3 places on Hill Street, maybe at First Neck Lane, maybe at Halsey Street, maybe over at Halsey Neck, where people tend to be going down toward the beach. Ways for pedestrians to more safely get across. Shows some markings. And even when there aren't pedestrians, those crosswalks may also have the added benefit of calming traffic, getting people to slow down
And there's additional signage.
additional signage. No one wants to urbanize the streetscape. On the other hand, little reminders like that actually go a long way subconsciously of reminding drivers that they're sharing the road. I know there are other places down Hampton Road, for instance, or parts of Meeting House Lane, or going down South Main Street for a little while, where, a crosswalk done tastefully with tasteful signage can be a real benefit in terms of encouraging people to walk or bicycle into the village.
I think another area which I thought in terms of quality of life is the parking issues that we have within the village business district, and the enforcement that's being done in connection with this parking. I think that we need to make sure that the employees do not park, that employees of the stores do not park, at customer parking areas. That the time limit for the parking is be more enforced and more strictly enforced. Because I think that this is something that we need to review, especially in light of the fact that I understand Cedar Rail is going to be expanding. So expanding, they're going to become a major store, and I'm not sure exactly.
Yeah, we spoke at length about parking at our last meeting, and so I know Joe McLaughlin has been doing a lot of work and research, pulling different ideas and concepts together.
For one, we should put more signs to make sure that people understand that there is parking behind the stores.
Yeah.
A lot of people who go around, drive around, they don't understand that you have to go inside to get the parking.
Right.
Just a bit more.
So I'm excited about the list of topics that we have to be working on over the next few months. I think they're very important topics for this village.
Yes.
So
I think in terms of what you were mentioning about Sag Harbor, being able to control the developments after they've had the sewage treatment plant in place. We also have very strict and very thorough zoning regulations that will control the development. So I'm really not worried about it. But as a matter of fact, as one of the elements of our zoning was to allow some residential above the stores, and we're unable to do it because we can't get the flow for any residential.
One of the things I mentioned about Sag Harbor, he didn't grow up in this area, but my wife's family grew up in Sag Harbor, and Sag Harbor didn't have a sewage treatment plant. It went right out in the bay. That's where it went.
It still does.
Well, it tends to, that's the other question too, is the sewage treatment plants break down,
Or overflow in storms.
or something mechanically crashes in a plant, what is your backup plan? This has been rotting around in my head, And wherever you put that plant, you want to make sure the neighbors know about it, because I think we're going to have a hell of a fight on our hands wherever we put that plant.
That's true. But I think that there are some good areas, good possibilities, that may not, I know about one that is not exactly in the village, but I thought that would be extremely appropriate, would be the property between the Burger King and the cemetery. Which is, although it's in the town area, it
Well,
would be a
I've
great-
worked in two plants, one the Southampton Hospital and the other one's a rehab. It's like night and day between the two plants. The hospital plant is an ancient plant, old. The rehab center is a relatively new, state-of-the-art plant. Well, you still smell it, but not too bad, not as much as you can over the hospital.
But that's just inside the building, is that right?
It's inside the building.
Right, it's not exterior of the
But
building.
The hospital technology is like
The hospital
50-year-old
employees
technology.
told me that they have monitoring wells all around the facility. And the wells north of the facility, the water quality is worse than the water quality south.
Okay.
So whatever's coming in from the north, coming from all the potato fields and all that stuff in there, and the stuff they have on the other side is in relatively better shape.
And this is at the hospital.
This is at the hospital. This is the
Where does
engineers-
where does the sewer go from the schools?
Hmm?
The schools,
Septic.
So the
Septic
into
schools
the
is
ground,
septic. The schools is septic,
Yeah.
right?
which is really not right.
And
We
the-
should put a
and the-
system.
And the condominium complexes behind, right?
Septic.
All septic, right?
Septic.
I'm trying to think, the latest one, I think they got built up on Hill Street, they're gonna
The
put a
town hall is
plant in.
septic.
Yeah, but that's more west of the hospital, right?
Yeah, the town hall they should do something about
Oh, that I agree with, but
I mean, they go
affecting the
straight-
hospital,
it. Yeah.
affecting these wells at the
There's
hospital,
only two treatment plants I know of in this area, and that's those two.
right?
Yes, it is very.
And then Sag Harbor's the third.
Visiting Belfort Village.
Yeah, sure.
Get to come up.
You have to come up to the name and address, or name anyway, right?
I'm Belfort, I'm from Belfort. Have you talked much to the mayor in Patchogue? Are you aware of what's going on over there?
Well, they have developed.
Densely populated, they just added a tremendous amount of housing. And
Right.
I think they have a very forward idea about sewage in towns like this that are not, Belport's a village, it's a different story, but Patchogue is a densely populated area, it's a different demographic than here, but they've been very forward thinking about certain things, like they have a 25-cent charge for plastic bag use that predated the state mandate. They just had a big music festival in the Great South Bay where they had a huge push for plastic use. And I've been very impressed with that mayor, not so much by our mayor, but by this guy in this big town. And I think they're pretty state-of-the-art of what urban sewage, what you do if you don't have sewers. And I think that's the problem here, if I'm correct, right? Anyway, that's just a...
We're aware of this project. They did a beautiful job.
I'm not sure how it's all going to play out in Patchogue, but I just know that they're surprising. It's a surprising, densely populated town. So.
Yeah.
I know somebody that considers it.
Paul? I
So we just,
I shedded a little responsibility there, Paul, and
Right,
delegated it to Mark.
yeah, it's So basically, we tabled point number 1, point number 2,
Right,
because I thought Eldon was really the leading
right.
force for the
He'll
point
be
number
here in
1.
5 minutes.
Yeah,
Oh, he'll be here in
yeah,
5
yeah,
minutes?
yeah.
And then Joe is not here.
Right. So you've been talking about number 3, I can
We
hear.
talked about 3, and then we also talked about the sidewalks, the need for more sidewalks in the village,
Need for more sidewalks, right,
more
right.
sidewalks in the village.
Right.
So this is where we are at.
Okay, so why don't we do the last one and then go back? So on the workshops, I think we want to do a second meeting, which would be more interactive and allow and maybe split up into more than one group and focus on specific issues. So thought we would experiment this month with the first one, maybe in 2 weeks. And is it easier? Is it easier on a Friday or a Saturday? Or I'm thinking this would, because when we've done these in the past, we've sort of invited village residents to come in and participate. So, and that's been pretty effective. So I would like to do it at a time that's easier for them.
I think breakfast on Saturday,
Is that good time?
9 o'clock or 10 o'clock?
Right.
10 o'clock on Saturday.
Yeah.
You'd have to do it early in the morning on Saturday because traffic with you,
Right,
spaces, and
right.
everything else would be a
Right.
premium.
So if we did it at 9 with the thought that we'd be out by like 10:30 or 11 and get people in.
Yeah, that's a good idea.
Yeah.
Is Friday,
Friday's possible also.
right,
If you think that's better.
Friday afternoon,
I think for
something
that-
possibly? I generally have a lot of client meetings on
Okay,
Saturdays.
right, of course. Is Village
That's
Hall's,
true.
there's no board meetings on Fridays, right?
No.
Right. So if we did it like Friday at 2 or something, you think that'd be
Do
good?
you think it's
I mean,
so?
what do you, in terms of all of you, how does it work?
I understand point, but I think Saturday morning for the public
Right.
might be more
Good.
convenient.
Any
You know,
thoughts
Friday bagel,
in the
Yeah.
audience?
Saturday's probably.
yeah.
Okay.
I would say on water quality in particular, if there is a group that's formed around Lake Agawam and they're able to do something on a Friday
Saturday,
afternoon,
right.
then I would say you might want to feel free to have that workshop on a Friday. And maybe
Right.
try 2 and see
Right.
whether Friday or Saturday grows
Yeah,
more.
yeah.
For that water
I mean, the good news
quality
about
issue.
Friday is you don't have all the social sort of stuff going on that I think makes it hard for people in the public to come in the summer. But either way, Mr. Mayor, any opinion one way or the other?
I'm fine anyway.
Okay.
Happy to come up there too, but
Right.
fine anyway as long as
Right,
it's easy for everybody.
right. So, how many Friday?
Yeah, Friday's fine.
Right?
Friday.
Okay.
Probably Friday.
Okay. So Friday, what time do you think? 3?
Uh,
That's probably good for anyone.
Gets everyone out by 5. And I do agree with you. I think if we're going to get any like Lake Agawam people, for example, to come, Friday's going to be easier for them than Saturday.
Check
There's
with
just a
them
lot
too,
going on, yeah.
but
Yeah.
maybe.
So Friday at 3 p.m. So
Right,
we do
right.
a Friday.
Right. Right.
You have a calendar? Let me see.
Tuesday's the 13th,
Right.
so 14th, 16th is Friday.
Or maybe the 23rd, which is the following Friday, so we can really organize for it and give people some notice. I think it's always important.
That would be
Well,
good. On the village website.
Friday, this 24th.
Right.
Friday the 24th. Yeah, that or the 17th.
24th,
24th.
so that people can prepare.
Friday.
So one thing I'd like to do at that meeting, and we talked about maybe we'll do two things and break up, is I think we can get from the survey firm, Squires and Holden,
Mhm.
get my mind back on, a large map, which we got once before, the village center.
Or the town can provide it.
Or
also.
the town can provide it, right.
Yeah, we should ask for
And
that.
maybe we can put it up or
Yeah.
put it on the table, so that, I think when we talk about the parking lots, it's very
Well,
useful
we
to
used
have
to
a
have
map.
We have.
We had it before.
We used to
It's
have
still,
one
it's still
here.
there.
Yeah.
I think it's in the back. Yeah, we do have.
But we have a photo, but what the survey also shows is obviously,
lots?
the lots.
No, but we can ask the town, it's just one button, and they'll show every lot.
Let's get it blown up.
Okay,
Right.
so let's ask the town. for that.
Right, right.
By the way, Friday's the 23rd, not the 24th.
Okay.
Oh, the Friday's the
Right,
23rd.
It is.
So I think that's going to be helpful as we
I have
talk
to
about
check
it.
out the doctor's appointment, but I don't remember what time.
Okay, so you'll check and we'll
Okay.
work it out.
Invite the doctor.
Okay, so I think one of the things we'd like to do at that meeting is sort of get into some of the issues
Yes.
with the lot. And I'm thinking, one of the things I'd like to do is CMAX Sammy, who was chair when that was done and who has, I think, some of the drawings that were done at the time, is asked him to bring some of the drawings that were originally done. So we don't repeat since a lot of that work did happen then.
Yeah.
Mark, were you on the commission at that point?
Yeah,
I thought so. Okay.
We can also bring the, whatever studies that was done by the county a few years ago. on
You
the
mean-
wastewater.
We were
Right.
talking about parking, I think.
Oh, you were talking about
I was talking about parking, yeah.
parking.
Yeah. I also think, and I don't, see if we can find it, there was a parking demand study done back around the same time.
But I think that we should also just look at parking management.
Right, well, but it
The
included
enforcement-
that.
the
It actually,
enforcement
there was a
of the-
parking management and demand study done, I believe, around the same time as the Village Center master plan, because the issue came up in some of the hearings, do we need to build a new parking garage?
And Mood Ray said, he was the one who brought that one up.
Right. So there was a study done, and what it showed was that the problem at the time, and obviously we'd have to revisit it, but I have a feeling that the village was actually busier then in terms of commerce. The problem was the distribution of spots and the management of spots, not the supply. There was much
Right.
more supply than we needed, but the distribution of spots wasn't working, and the management of the spots wasn't
We were
working.
just talking before about
Right.
the employee parking.
Right.
Employee yes.
Right.
And how it should be better managed,
Yeah.
and make sure that the employees park in a certain area.
Right. Right.
Or should it be designating spots for the employees to park?
Right. Yeah.
Yes, I think so, should be.
Right. I was at another, Mark, you brought it up before, I think, but it's very interesting. I was at another panel on the West Coast. They were talking about how they started charging for parking, and that actually helped the village. Because it turned out people were more concerned about availability than they were about having to pay. And so there was free parking available, and there was pay parking available. And it actually helped a lot with management. And one of the things it did is it drove employees off the main street, because they absolutely would not pay for parking.
And nowadays,
Right, so
and now-
they ended up on the back street, and the summer visitor, in this case in Northern California, didn't mind paying $1 for parking for an hour, was much more concerned about the fact that that meant if they went into town, they knew they were likely to find a spot.
and
It was sort of a version of what East Hampton does with its main lot.
That's
And
right, just
nowadays-
East Hampton has something like that. Behind the
Right.
stores, you pay, but
Right.
if you go over to where the school is, you don't pay. And there's
Right.
a bus shuttle taking you back and forth.
Right,
and nowadays we could develop an app for the village parking.
right. You could pay on the app.
On the app, exactly.
Right.
So, and if you shop, you show it, you get free parking.
Right.
Or something like this.
Right. So it was just interesting because the issue came up, similar sort of problems, very high demand in the summer, not other times, everyone's competing for the spots close.
Yes.
So it was just interesting. It was very similar management issues.
Yeah.
So parking lots at that meeting, I think we will have more talks with the trustees about the wastewater management issues and think about what would be useful to discuss at that meeting. And then finally, while we wait for Eldon, I think, one of the initiatives, so when we redid the zoning, one of the things that obviously came up in our review and came up also in the review by Nelson Pope and Voorhees was the issues in the historic district, both with the age of the outline, that's the wrong word, how, the sort of, the idea that the boundaries of the historic district are probably outdated at this point. And even within the historic district, if you look at the report, multiple buildings that are called out no longer exist. Other buildings that most people would say are important were not deemed as important in those days. For one thing, it's 30 years ago, so, buildings from the 60s or 50s were not deemed at that time to be important. Some of those would not be deemed to be important. So, and then secondly, trying to modernize our regulations so they reflect best practices by other villages on Long Island. And so, about a year ago, Eldon had begun to sort of focus on this. He spoke to the State Historic Preservation Office about some of the resources that are available through them. And then, there's obviously a lot of very experienced and knowledgeable people in the village on these issues. And so, I think one of the things that he wants to do is put together a task force on that, and perhaps if wastewater management is not the right thing to talk about at our workshop meeting, that may be one of the other things we get to talk about. I think most people have not read the historic district plan probably in a long time, except those who deal with it on a more constant basis. And so, it's not necessarily a bad plan, it's just very, very outdated at this point. In terms of what other, the way most others read, and certainly the district is outdated. And I think it obviously, we've also heard from the boards, it would be helpful to them to have a more clear plan in terms of what, guiding the way that review happens. So, I know an issue you care a lot about.
Also, the other thing is the finding process.
Right.
I think I understand it's only $800 repair.
Right.
And when you're selling a house for $4 million, what's $800?
Cost of business, that's all.
Right.
My suggestion, 2-year moratorium and make them reapply all over again to all the boards.
Right. That was something we did
That would
discuss.
hurt them more than any dollar amount going.
Right.
That'll make them think about it.
Yeah. I would say, just to their credit, the building department also has become much more, they're much more on target with monitoring those circumstances. So.
Yeah, but I think that maybe we could set some more procedures
Right.
for even the ERB when they review the properties that have some historical value, that they should be more have better set guidelines.
We had a
As to
book
how
at
to-
one time that was in the building department that they would give out.
It's still there, I believe. I think the problem is it's just.
It's still there.
Right.
We had to determine if it was resolution, which is why the documents, I'm sorry, Charlie. So not to be on the defensive, but the
Right.
reason why the website didn't have a lot of documents is we didn't know many of these documents existed, not the comprehensive plan, not the design guidelines, but the key is they also had to be resolutions
Right.
for certain categories. So what you see there, Wayne Brune did a lot of investigation. Julie went down into our basement, which is like a treasure hunt. But to your point, those design guidelines are available in the building department. They are now available online, and I think your point of having everybody really read all of that
Right.
would be very helpful. Plus, I had a question on H2M, how that triangulates, because they did this comprehensive study as well. So before of the loading and the, so I don't know where that fits in, but I think everybody should at least look at that.
Yeah, no, I agree. So it's interesting you bring that up. So the H2M study actually did look at, and has, I think, very good numbers. What they were good at, without a doubt, was it has the current load. Mark was actually very involved with this. Current load used in the village center, and then what the projected future load was at reasonable build out over, I think, 20 years, was it?
Yeah, but basically
Using the zoning.
Yes, they got as part of the study, we got the numbers from the Suffolk County Water Authority of the actual water usage,
Right.
which is in the village for the last couple of years. So that's what was the basis, that was the base point, and then we...
And do you know what the base number was?
I have it somewhere
10,000.
Right, right.
on 10,000. I think 110,000 was the capacity that was, but the actual usage was a lot less.
Yes,
Oh,
that was, the 110 was what you needed at build-out. I think it was
Yeah,
like
build-out.
30,
I
35,
think it was
something like
30,000,
that.
it's 30, someplace in the 30s,
For the
you know.
CBD, for the,
Yes, for the business district. And then, so what we had done was we said, okay, assuming that you built out, according to the zoning, what you could build out in 20 years, what was the requirement? Right. But the current need is actually a lot less.
And as a matter to your response to, in case of a failure, as part of the design of a sewage treatment plant, you have to have an expansion. So you have to be able
Yes.
to build
Yes.
the exact
Add on.
same.
And that's
So you
going to be
have
true.
twice
So
the area.
just let me actually caveat that a little bit, and we'll obviously get into this more at a workshop meeting. As part of a sewer district, you need to show you have full capacity. It has nothing to do with which technology you use.
Yes.
So just from a legal point of view, once you establish a sewer district, which you can tax and raise money and everything
Right.
else, under the county law, you have to show that there's capacity, maybe not day one, but eventually, to
Full
handle
maximum- to handle
the maximum growth,
Yes, exactly.
right? So let's say you said, okay, I'm at 30 now, and I think I'm going to need to be 100. You would have to show you can do the 30 now, but within a reasonable period of time,
Right.
you have the capacity
Yes,
to
and
manage.
this was actually one of the, based on the usage that we have for the village, we could have gone to the hospital plant
Right.
because they had that difference. But it was only at the present usage, not if everybody else was allowed to do it.
Right.
Based on if everybody else was going to use it, the hospital plant was too small
Right. Yeah, there was enough excess capacity that you could use
for the present use.
for the present use of the village. And so let's say, for example, you decided you would do 2 sewer plants rather than
Yeah,
one.
exactly.
You could say, well, today I'm using the hospital plant, and then in the next 10 years, I'm going to build another plant, and that's going to handle the growth.
Right.
So those were the sort of options we didn't look at that point that I think are, certainly on an agenda. And that's also going to be true even if you decided there was another technology you're going to use. You would still have to show that over time you could absorb that usage. But you're right. It's exactly the issue. In the current use, the hospital plan could accommodate it.
Yes, but not the use that you have to design for.
Right.
Hereby.
Yeah.
Okay. Jesse Warren, 81 David Weiss Lane, as we know. So thanks for bringing all that up.
Right.
Paul and I had spoken earlier,
Right.
obviously, about that. And,
Right.
I'm glad we're bringing back the potential to tap into the hospital. That is something that I'd love for H2M to study in their proposal to us.
Right.
But I just wanted to reiterate kind of the 3 really important things that I'm hoping and looking forward for the Planning Commission, to work on. One is the water treatment. So I could not be more excited about kind of getting that study rolling
Right.
and having potentially a subcommittee for that.
Right.
The second, as we spoke about, is the expansion of the historical district. That's obviously another team as well, and we're hoping potentially Eldon Scott could, and maybe Joe McLaughlin could lead that team. And then obviously parking being the third big project,
Right.
and those, to some extent, go hand in hand as well.
Right, right.
So that's pretty much what I wanted to reiterate.
Great.
So I think we're on a good start here, and if we can be of any help, please let us know. I'm happy to obviously continue to come to all the meetings, but also any backing up that is needed for any of these projects. Myself and Trustee Allen and the board are happy to kind of push this forward, given the work that everyone's doing. So,
I'm wondering if maybe one of the things we want to do, and particularly in preparation for the workshop, is make copies of some of these documents and sort of leave them, like when you walk up to the May desk, you can get a copy and take a look at it. Because I think one of the things that is helpful is for people to read, if they have the chance to read it. Some people go online, not everybody will, in my experience, so that people can actually read the documents and see them. So I think that would be really helpful. So anything else?
No, I think that we've
Thank you, everyone.
Okay.
Thanks.
I think we've covered a lot
Okay.
of material.
Can I speak for just a moment?
Yes, of
Yeah,
course.
sure.
Under what sounded like one topic, you'd covered a lot of ground, so I'm going to
Right.
try to, these may sound a little disjointed. I'm wondering with respect to the hospital septic.
Right.
I know the hospital's going to be redeveloped,
Right.
and they need to just hold that resource until it's determined what's going to happen there. And I also know it's an older technology. I've heard this from other people as well.
Right.
So there may be some limitations. But I just wonder out loud whether, given the density of the school use and town hall right nearby,
Right.
if that might be an appropriate use for some of that excess capacity, either now or going forward. That's a very heavy load in a small area. And the condominiums may be in as well, private development. But there are some intensive uses within, a couple hundred yards of that hospital that would seem to me to be relatively easy to think about piping in there if it was an appropriate use of that excess capacity.
Yeah, I think that the hospital plant is at a very good location, also topographically, that it's at a low point.
Right.
It's like there is a lot of open space near it for the leaching field and for so it is a great location to expand the sewage treatment plant. It would be, if we were able to work
Right.
something out with the hospital, it's a prime location.
Well, I mean, I'd love, as a village resident, I'd love to see that used for a larger use as part of
Right.
a larger solution. But if it's
Right.
determined that there's either a better place for that larger solution,
Right.
or that you can't get the full solution you need because of future expansion, all of
Right.
that over at the hospital, there might be some ways to carve out or create
Right.
sort of a smaller micro-district over there to take
Yeah,
advantage of that
could be,
capacity.
yeah.
Right.
I just wanted to talk a little bit about the guidelines as well. There is a book of guidelines.
Right.
It's now available on the
Right.
ARB website. I've spoken with Jay Deasing, and I'm not speaking for him, but one idea he threw out, it was his idea, was that he might want to talk to some people who help fund the Southampton Association to see if they might underwrite a printing of it. Right
Right.
now, I think that book is $20.
Right.
And for your $20, you get a really bad black and white copy.
Right.
And it's not very readable.
Right.
Now, there's a good copy that people can print out and color from the website,
Right.
but his idea was maybe we can get a couple hundred copies to just
Right.
have and give out up there. If we
Thinking
can,
about the historic.
It should be-
if we can find either maybe the village underwriter or
Yeah.
even private underwriters.
Yeah.
There's a lot of interest in
Right.
disseminating those
Yeah.
more broadly. With respect to the code, and again, member of the ARB, but not here to speak on their behalf, but I know I, for one, and also as a village resident, would appreciate, and I think Wayne and Bo have been doing some work on this, looking for areas of nonconformity, trying to find where the course that everyone tried to design years ago has been done by committee over time,
Right,
so we
right.
have camel, and trying to find some of those humps and getting rid of them.
Right.
And I know that Sag Harbor's gone through this issue 3 or 4 times in the last 15 years.
Yep.
Twice specifically with respect to ARB code.
Mhm.
And 2 things that to me are very interesting about what they did. They had what we had previously, which was 2 sections of the code, one dealing generally with architecture and one dealing with the historic district. And it was just like our code, 2 separate codes. They actually merged them together, simplified, removed what were some, if not obvious, potential conflicts. And they basically say every property in the village needs to do X, and if you're in the historic district, you are also subject to Y.
Yeah.
And it's very clear. The next time that was the first revision. The second revision, they very specifically went in to address some issues that are very analogous to, I think, some of the concerns that I know I face on the board and people talk about. They took the word size
Mhm.
and they put it in a prominent part.
Right.
And they took the term gross living area, I think,
Right.
or is that right? What gross floor area, GFA.
Yeah, GFA.
They put GFA in prominently as well. And those 2 terms are 2 of the 4 criteria
Right,
categories
right.
that their ARB is specifically empowered to use,
Mhm.
required to use,
Right.
in judging an application.
Right.
And they can judge on any one of them.
Right.
So the architecture may look great and the materials may look great, but if it's too big, it's too big.
Right.
And so they gave that discretion and power to
Right.
their ARB.
Right.
In my opinion, if we had a similar event and a similar revision of our code, it would remove, at least 50% of the source of confusion, but
Right.
also angst that many
Right.
people have on size issues.
Can I ask you a question? When I was on the ARB board, we would have people come in and not knowing they're buying a house in a historic district. Real estate people would never tell them.
Right.
And that was one of my pet peeves.
Yes,
I think
agreed.
they still do it.
Well, I'm glad you brought that up, because I know that one of the charges to our board in the code is to be a source of education. It's not clear exactly what our megaphone is to do that other than in our meetings. But I would love to see, personally, I'd love to see in tax bills, tax bills can be coded by property
Correct.
code. They are already.
Right.
We can cross-reference the list, and we could put in another page to the tax bills for anyone in the historic district, just reminding them that they're in the historic district. That's not upfront notice,
Right, right.
but it's annual notice that you're in the historic district. If you have questions about what that means, you could come to an ARB
Right,
meeting or
right.
talk to the building department. I think this, I have seen personally in some of the applications before us, what to me is clear evidence that someone was really unaware that they were in the historic district.
We had the
or-
same problem.
Or what it meant. And really, people can get angry at them for not embracing the spirit of having a house in the historic district and having some sense of
We've
stewardship.
had a few angry people at us when on our board, yes.
But if there's not effective notice, you can say they should know. The lawyers should tell them at least at closing. But I think the village could do some more, the board could do some more to really underscore that.
It's interesting because I think about the zoning journey we went on over a multi-year period, which started with a civil war and ended up a lot calmer. One thing that we kept saying at the beginning, which turned out to be the case by the end, was the more you defined it, actually the less fighting you had. Because the worst thing for people is feeling that the process is arbitrary, right? So if people feel the process is fair, they'll bitch and moan and complain, but they're willing to accept it. So, we've actually, if you look at the zoning 12 years ago versus today, it's a lot tighter in many ways. And to me, there's much less complaining than you would expect because because everyone knows what they can and can't do. And so I think one of the problems I see now with the historic district, partially just because of the passage of time and everyone's interpretation over the years, which was some of the problem we had with zoning. Like you would talk to John Forster and he would say, well, yeah, I know it says that, but the way we've always interpreted the zoning is X or Y, right? And he was right. But on the other hand, that meant that if you read it, you were not necessarily reading it accurately the way it actually worked. So it's, part of it, I think the reason, as you're saying, to redo the regs and that, say, Hub, for example, is that it is, when you redo it, you have a chance not only maybe to fix things, but also to be much clearer. This is the way it works. This is what you need to do. This is what is or is not going to be approved.
And for better, for worse,
Right.
probably a lot of us do. I have a number of friends and speak to a lot of people who are real estate agents.
Right.
This is entirely anecdotal, but I've heard over the last 6 to 9 months
Right.
that there's a little tremor going through the real estate brokerage community that basically says for some of their buyers, they get enough into a house hunt in Southampton Village,
Right.
and they start either reading things in the paper or hearing
Right.
stories about how difficult, how uncertain things are.
Right.
This could take a long time.
Right.
Don't really know, and it's caused an increasing number of people to say, well, maybe I'll take a look over at Hampton Bays. What can you
Right.
show me over
Right.
there? I get
Right.
more for my
Yeah,
money, and
right.
it doesn't sound like I have to deal with this.
Right.
So it does have an impact on property values.
I disagree.
No, I
I have
don't-
people saying I can't believe you have a leaf blower ban. It's the only quiet
Oh,
place. The
right.
houses are beautiful. The
I'm
people
just
are great.
I'm just talking about land use
Yeah.
regulations.
I don't think,
Just
I think,
land
I
use
that-
haven't heard
regulations.
it.
I think that it goes the other way because I think that we are a community where we care about our quality of life, where we care about the streetscape.
I think you're
where we
both
care-
correct to some extent. So
I don't
agree.
think I think
Right.
if the impact, if there is such an impact, it's positive.
I'm not saying overall. I'm saying on quality of life, I agree with you. We're starting to be a bit of a beacon. It's specifically on the uncertainty about whether you're in the historic district or not.
Right.
Can I get this variance or not get this variance? Is this compatible with the architectural code? Is it not? How long might it take? We've had some cases that have dragged on for better, for worse. That scares people. There's just this sense on land use specifically
Right.
that there's enough uncertainty and differences of opinion and interpretation
Right.
that there's a cost to that
Right.
in their minds.
Well, I think that the timing is great, and we've spoken on the phone before, and subsequent to that, I've spoken to pretty much all of the heads of boards, and I know Paul has in the head of board
Right,
meetings, and
right.
it seems like there's pretty unanimous support to move on something So I think, I think now we have some new people
Right.
in office as trustees, so I think it's a really good time to focus on it.
And I believe, maybe Kimberly, you could just nod, I know you're not on camera, but I believe that Wayne and Bo have been tasked as of about a year and a half ago to go through and try to find some of the areas of interpretation, misunderstanding, inconsistency, and at least list those out and maybe push that out to boards and others to.
No, I'll just add
Bob,
this.
I'll ask one question. Have you had any problem with the ZBA?
Can I just, let me answer that. So
We don't wanna go off
I do
topic.
think the trustees have worked very hard in recent years, and I want to give them credit for it, where credit's due, to try to bring the board chairs together, to try to work out some of these issues.
Oh, yeah.
We
have-
saw the law that we passed, that we recommended at the last meeting. I think there's been a tremendous effort by the trustees to begin to clean up that process. So that, because I think all the board chairs feel the same way. They don't want to be in the spot of, saying the opposite of other boards, intervening with other boards, overlapping with other boards. So I think that is an issue, but I think they've been working very hard to try to address it, so.
And all of you, thanks to all of you. I mean, we spent a lot of time on the GFA analysis, and that took us 9 to 10 months to bring to legislation. We had the pyramid law. We just brought in the flat roof law. Of course, we just looked at easing the application process now with the lot line, with the tennis courts and a couple other pieces around that. So you could just, they're so benign, an applicant doesn't have to go to all these different boards. They just end up with the ARB. It saved them 2 to 3 months. You're absolutely right. I can only tell you what I was involved in, and I do know the mayor and you and I discussed this, and I think you and I did as well, Eldon, did engage 1, if not 2 law firms to look into those components that Rob so nicely articulated. And I don't know where that stands, but this is actually a takeaway for me to try and tee up, the current mayor with that and see where it stands. But I know that's specifically what we wanted to look at. And I know you did a very, very good job pulling together an initial group of people to kind of look at the design guidelines and just see what can we do. It wasn't a committee, it was just a brainstorming session, and a lot of those individuals want to come back and support this. So time is of the essence, but I think we've, a lot was accomplished. And, of course,
And one thing I would point out, and Elvin knows this world better than I do, but there's certainly grants available from the state, from the National Historic Preservation Organizations to do this sort of work.
No, I've spoken to the Historic Preservation Office, SHPO, in Albany, and they have a person who's in charge of village and small jurisdictions for justice purposes for ARBs, and they provide technical support. They have roughly said that there's nothing terribly wrong with our code as it's written, but there's certainly room for looking at it more carefully and how we're using it. And so there's a lot of resources there. And we initially had talked, before this last cycle of election, about just getting the existing design guidelines reprinted, which I think we could do before the next
We
meeting.
were talking about it before you came in,
I think that's just an easy win.
Yeah.
One thing we could do, which is not to say it shouldn't be looked at further, but it exists.
Right.
So that'd be great to get out.
Yeah.
But I think the requirements that we have are really not very strict in terms of historic preservations. And I think that we should make it, we could require a lot more of a study, a lot more, as part of the applications. I think that the material that's asked to be provided as part of the application process, to me, is not up to standard. We should ask for a lot more samples.
Well, and I think part of that is process, which I hope would be looked at as part of this, because you have, I don't practice any real estate out in the East End, but I do build things in the city and other cities. And, we'll be working on a large project. We'll spend $250,000 on consultants. You're building a $5 to $10 million home in the Hamptons. You probably have a bank of consultants. The village has volunteers, and I applaud you for going through these things, but you don't necessarily have the depth of professional review of all the documents.
Exactly. And also, in all fairness to the board, the Architectural Review Board, they are not really fed information that's required for them to be able to make the right decisions. You see, they're only, fed only the minimum that needs to be, where in fact, they should be, the applicant should be required to provide
But some of
them
that's
a lot more
process as much
information.
as it is the actual
Correct,
code.
correct.
You know, how.
When I was on board, we had classes that we would go to. I've forgotten, if maybe Catherine Bellows would organize the classes, the state would bring out somebody,
Yeah.
and they
That's
would
what you've
teach
been
us.
talking
Yeah,
about.
they're ready to do that.
Yeah, you've been
That's
talking
what
about
came
that.
up,
I think it would also be useful to have those classes for architects in the village. So they have more of an understanding. Because one thing, watching some of the tape, it's always dangerous watching tape, it's so different when you're in the room. But so watching the tapes, one of the things that strikes me is how confused, maybe is the right word, some of the local architects are about what is appropriate for a historic preservation request. So just one thing you and I have talked about, in the practice as a whole now, the rule is that you don't try to, as we all know, you don't try to duplicate exactly the original structure. You want to show that it evolved over time. It seems to me many of our local architects think your role is to create a worse version of what was originally done, more than anything else. Because we can't afford, in many ways, the type of craftsmanship, and people don't want the type of craftsmanship in terms of small windows and everything that was in the original structure.
Yeah.
Whereas sometimes the right answer is to do something that's different.
I also think
But-
in the last zoning review that we
Fits,
did,
right.
one interesting
Right.
thing was how she had pointed out that the
Right.
community has to kind of decide what its
Right.
guidelines are.
Right.
I mean, our laws could be tightened up, but
Right.
it's really how our community wants to use them.
Right,
So
right.
we may feel that, 100% restorations is the way to go. We may feel that showing the modern with the old is the way to go.
Right, right.
We need to make sure that that's been
Correct.
discussed and
Yeah,
some consensus.
yeah.
Right.
If I could just speak to that, I've looked at enough codes in places that people like to refer to as guidelines, for better, for worse,
Right.
Nantucket,
Right.
Palm Beach, places like that. And there are real arguments in every case for why they took them to that level. And in
Right.
some cases, the arguments held water and they've worked over time
Right.
and people have bought into them.
Right.
And in other cases, it's been an ongoing source
Right.
of tension and some people
Yeah.
feel it's overburdensome. But a lot of those outcomes have to do with what was the dialogue that went into
Right.
making them or
Right.
fine-tuning them.
Right.
And I would just, because you mentioned, I think, a little bit about, I think what I heard about what Bo and Wayne might have been doing as part of their assessment of code and some other things was also, without a doubt, aimed at the process, at simplifying and making more user-friendly the process. An architect here in town mentioned to me that he thought he could send his, I think at the time, 7-year-old daughter over to East Hampton with a pretty complex project, and she could read their 6-page introduction
Right.
as to what someone needed to do and determine whether he needed to do steps A through H or
Right,
J
right.
through P.
Right.
And that they have, I don't know what their document is, so I'm speaking a little out of turn, but secondhand, they've done something to this process
Right.
to really make it more streamlined, more easier to understand. And that's obviously part of what you were talking about,
Right.
Paul, in terms of, getting rid of uncertainty and
Right.
making a better.
And I think that's what we found with zoning. It's like people complained a lot at the beginning, but once they got used to it, they sort of liked the idea. I mean, Builder now in Southampton knows pretty easily what they can and can't do. And, I've watched the sort of agendas at the ZBA and the zoning board about zoning sort of dwindle to virtually nothing. So it's interesting because I think the prediction originally when this first came up 12 years ago was, oh, the ZBA is going to break down because everyone's going to be applying for an exemption. And actually, virtually no one does. I mean, there are people who do. They have special circumstances. They're on a corner. There's some issue about their lot. But the vast number of buildings that are built now, houses in the village, from a zoning point of view, just, apply and are done. So it seems now the ARB has a more difficult job because there are judgments that need to be made, and zoning is more judgment-free in a way.
Yeah.
But still, it seems to me one of the things that is, and I think your point before is, to the extent that people know at the beginning exactly what they can and can't do, it does really change
Right,
the
well,
context.
at a minimum, it would be great if some of this were in
Right.
code, but to the extent that it's even in a design guideline, I think
Right.
it's very helpful for the ARB, because at least you can say, here's a design guideline, it's not
Right.
specifically code, but it's been through a public process, and the community is comfortable with this set of guidelines.
And let me actually use a dumb example because I think it's a good example in how these things can work. We made a decision, right or wrong, you could argue, but 12, 14 years ago, we want to encourage as much as we can detached detached garages. So we keep the historic nature of how lots were developed in our village. And 90% of the houses are developed with detached garages. You're not required, but there's things in the zoning that make it an incentive, and people are pretty clear that that's what everyone wants to see. That's a good example of where, Eldon's point before, the village residents expressed what they wanted, and that's what happened. And I think part of the problem is village residents haven't had a chance really to say, this is what we want the ARB doing, right? I mean, we hear only from people who complain, basically, and I'm willing to come to a hearing and get beat up, but we don't hear from the vast number of village residents, what do you really want to see?
The other issue, I think, with respect to the ARB, you said it's a little less sort of engineering-based, if you will, than the ZBA is. Because of that, because there is always an element of judgment at the end of the day, one of the things that has changed in the last 10 years is that the work sessions have gone away.
Right.
And I know there's good reason for it, and the board stubbed its toe and the village got spanked because of an issue that came up at a work session that wasn't followed through with. But you know, what we're essentially asking in some ways, which to me feels a little bit unreasonable, is for, and you mentioned a big house, people can maybe have a budget for $100,000 or more for consultants. On a smaller house, we're essentially asking people to spend the time and the money to develop essentially complete plans for something that the ARB may say, we don't like this. The entire concept needs to go. So there's not really a venue for them unless they want to come into the building department and they get some guidance there, but they're not hearing it from the ARB and there's not public input. So that's what gets lost when you don't have the work sessions, and that's part of what builds some of the tension and the angst, is someone who comes in and says, I've spent 6 months doing this, I spent $20,000 with my architects, and you want me to start again from scratch? So having some way to maybe get a consultative function back in through work sessions, even at the end of each meeting, something with the appropriate legal guidance.
Rob, at our work session, we used to encourage people with building houses to come in, show us, before you application, show us and see what you're doing, and we'll tell you if yes, no, up or down. And we used to do this at our work session.
I don't want to lionize Sag Harbor. I just happen to know it because I did a couple projects there myself. And they have people come into their work sessions literally with a hand sketch on an 8.5 by 11 with copies of it, saying, this is what I think, this is what my architect has done for an elevation, here's the site plan, here's what I'm thinking of, here's a list of materials. Nothing more than that. And a lot of the heavy chopping takes place based on about 3 hours of preparation and maybe a couple $100 of reproduction costs or something. To your question, I'm not going to answer your question about the ZBA. I think they do as good a job as the ARB does. I'll answer that way. But I will say that some other codes allow, I know we've got a couple provisions in our code that either allow or require the ZBA to kick things over to the ARB. We've got 2 of them on our agenda right now. But other codes give more discretion to a zoning board, where even one member in some cases, or a majority of members, could say, you know, this is an interesting proposal. We can make the zoning calculations and assessments, but this is an architecturally sensitive project, architecturally sensitive area. And before we move forward, we would like an opinion from the ARB. Now, you don't want to drag things on, but that could provide some coordination where you don't have to start back at square one and where the 2 boards can be on the same page. You might be able to get some efficiency.
It sounds like they've improved over the years, because we used to have clashes with them in subdividing property and what to do with carriage houses.
I do think that's been ameliorated to a large extent. So let me just maybe wrap up by saying, you know, this is an issue this group has been talking about for a long time. There's several different ways of doing it. You can do it through a workshop. One thing we've talked about at this commission is the possibility of having a staff person, so you do a staff review with someone who has expertise and can give guidance to an applicant in a more informal way and say, you know, gee, I'm not sure this is,
I think this is the right way. A staff review, to have a staff person would be something that I think your village should really
So, but these are the things, I think, as Eldon keeps saying, this is some of it is the code, but I've been always struck when you show people our code, it's not like they say, oh my God, that's a terrible code. It's more how it's been interpreted, the hair that's grown on it, and then the process that makes it difficult. So,
on this historical code process, the town has this architectural historical commission, and they do have a staff person with whom you interact and you talk to, and I think that's a very, very good method.
So I think let's we're going to figure out about we're going to do a workshop meeting on the 24th, which is a Friday
23rd.
afternoon. 23rd, sorry, Friday afternoon. I'll keep making that mistake.
2 o'clock, you say?
3 o'clock.
3 o'clock.
And I think this may be a good thing where we could bring the guidelines and, because I do believe, as you say, most people haven't read them, which is a classic problem. So again, I want to apologize on my behalf, certainly, maybe helping also for the worst traffic I've ever seen in the way the Hamptons, 4 hours a little later, but and for the meeting starting late. But thank you for attending the July, August meeting.
Thank you.
Thank you.